Right, good afternoon and welcome everyone to Network 2020's discussion about the US stated new policy focus on the Western Hemisphere. I realize that events in the Middle East may call that strategy into question, but we are still looking at an assertive foreign policy in this side of the world, as events in Venezuela and Cuba and Ecuador underscore. So it is still time to focus on the Western Hemisphere, and we look very much forward to this conversation today. A few words about Network 2020. We are an inclusive international community. We're based in New York City, and we're really trying to examine the intersection of business and geopolitics, and really elevate conversations around global affairs. So we hold conversations virtually, like these ones, as well as in person in New York. So if you're in the New York area, we encourage you to join us in person. And for those who join us virtually, we're very glad you're here. We have two guests today. We have Monica de Bolle and Jason Marczak. Monica is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and is host of Policy for the Planet, which is a podcast about economics, public health, and climate adaptation. And we're also pleased to have Jason Marczak with us. He is Vice President and Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. He has 25 years of expertise in regional economics, politics, and development, working with high-level policymakers and private sector executives to shape public policy. So welcome to you both. Jason, I'd love to just start with you. So the 2025 National Security Strategy, which came out in November 2025, I know it feels like a very long time ago now, but it really marked a clear shift in attention to Latin America. And so I just want to just start with trying to understand what changed either in the region or in Washington that elevated Latin America in this national security strategy. And what are a couple of the two or three most significant points that you think came out in the strategy that might have the most potential impact?
Well, Courtney, thank you so much for having me. And Monica, great to be here speaking with you, at least virtually together. I guess we could have met at at a halfway point or come to one of our offices. Courtney, love the work that you do over at Network 2020. It's just learning about the organization. What a fantastic organization and your mission. So thank you very much for having me and for having this conversation today. So what's changed? Why has Latin America been elevated? I think I go back to a couple different things. Is one is we saw a focus on Latin America in the first Trump administration. Rewind back to that first administration, where among other things, President Trump at the time worked toward trying to bring a change in Venezuela. At that time, it was through bringing together a coalition of countries. It was with his national security advisor at the time, John Bolton, who advised him on this. He recognized an interim president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, brought together about 60 different countries, and so he had a focus on Venezuela specifically in his first administration. As well as focusing on commercial diplomacy and focusing on the Mexico relationship. Again, rewind, and it was President Trump who negotiated the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA, which replaced NAFTA. So he did a couple important things, especially from a commercial perspective, with regard to our hemisphere, and those are just two of the many things that he prioritized in the first administration. Now, take us to Mr. Trump 2, and a couple of different things. One is he spends a lot of time in South Florida, and South Florida is the epicenter of talking about Latin America in the United States. Miami is the northernmost capital of Latin America and the Caribbean. So the president is consistently surrounded by people in the South Florida community that care deeply about the region, right? Second, his Secretary of State, right? So he brought on Secretary Rubio as Secretary of State. No Secretary of State has ever known Latin America as well as Secretary Rubio knows the region. Of course, for fluent Spanish-speaking Secretary of State, somebody who dedicated his entire career in the Senate to issues on Latin America, and specifically things like we're seeing the administration now focusing on, things like how to bring about a transition in Venezuela. Obviously, the secretary's family history, Cuba. His family had to flee Cuba because of the totalitarian regime there. So, for him, also changing Cuba is a top professional and personal priority as well. You got people like an incredible Deputy Secretary of State, Chris Landau, as well. His family, his father served across the region. Chris is, or the deputy secretary, has lived across the region. So he has top people that he's put in place. The State Department, his own previous work in Latin America has helped to further elevate the importance of the region. And so those are a couple of different kind of reasons why Latin America has been elevated. And Secretary Rubio has been very clear from the beginning about his focus on the region, the number of trips he's done to the region, Secretary Landau, the number of other cabinet officials travel the region. It's pretty impressive. And so we see this then playing out, and I'll end here, Courtney. We see this then playing out with the national security strategy that came out at the end of last year. That previous national security strategies had, maybe a half a page, maybe three-quarters of a page, if lucky, focused on the Western Hemisphere was essentially an afterthought in national security strategies. This strategy, I think about 4 full pages dedicated to the Western Hemisphere, and it wasn't an afterthought by any means. It was actually the primary driver. And for the administration, the Western Hemisphere is seen as being critical for U.S. domestic security and also for ultimately U.S. power projection globally. That if we don't, we need a secure, safe hemisphere in order to be able to have security within our own borders, but also be able to do so internationally.
All right, great. Thank you. That was a terrific setup there. Monica, turning to you, another big player in the region is China. And this is also where the national security strategy, I think, received some critique in that it didn't focus a lot on China, definitely a lot more in Latin America. So I'm curious to understand what reactions you're seeing in the region to the White House's renewed focus on the Western Hemisphere, particularly when it comes to navigating this dynamic with China. What's at stake? What's the scope of China's role? And how much wiggle room do some of the different countries have?
So thank you. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm very happy to be here also with Jason. So it's really a pleasure. Let me try to get to your question from the following perspective, picking up on something that Jason was saying at the very end of his remarks. So one thing that we did see very clearly over the past several decades, actually, looking at, the region, Latin America as a whole, and so on, is that several U.S. administrations prior to this one, or I should say prior to President Trump's first mandate, were really not that focused on the region for quite some time. I mean, they were focused on issues such as immigration, yes, narco trafficking, yes, Venezuela, yes, Cuba. But in general, there wasn't much interest outside of the scope of those topics and those specific countries and issues. And one thing that, has clearly come back, and it's very clearly stated that way in the NSS and the National Security Strategy, is precisely this wider focus on the whole of the region and on issues that go beyond, immigration, drugs, narco traffickers, and so on, to include, a lot of economic objectives, which are now tied in the US perspective to national security goals. So, and that's really important because when we try to then think about how these countries position themselves vis-a-vis China and the US, they're very different approaches. The Chinese approach is very different to the US approach now. And that matters, that matters for the region, that matters to how, several countries are and will react to pressures that are coming from these two. I think it's also important to underscore that even though China didn't receive as much direct attention in the national security strategy document, it did receive a lot of indirect attention. And that is very much underscored by, how the document perceives the region, how the document perceives Latin America. So when you read the sections of it that, are speaking specifically about US goals in the region, China is there, very much there in the background. And the whole sort of thrust of the document is to say, the Western Hemisphere is the US backyard. We want, we, the US, want to look again at the region and have a type of proximity to the region that we haven't had in recent years. And in a sense, that means elbowing China out, which in many ways is problematic. And it's problematic, because China in the past few years, when the US hasn't been very involved in the region, China has become increasingly involved in the region. Many, many countries are now very heavily dependent on China. And there are countries that are uniquely dependent on China, like Peru, for example, with all the activities and investments that the Chinese have done in that economy in that country specifically. But every country in the region is dependent on China to some degree. And thus, this idea that the US comes in and then there's less room for China, that doesn't quite work, with sort of the reality on the ground. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. On the other hand, for a lot of these countries, and from a strictly economic viewpoint, because there's a whole sort of political discussion in the background as well, but from a strictly economic viewpoint, for many of these countries, or for all of them really, having the US again being interested and being engaged and wanting to, pursue a lot of different initiatives and projects in the region is a very good thing, because so far, the region has always been the recipient of US foreign direct investment. But given that now the thrust is different, given that now the objectives are different, and there's much more of an inclination to be engaged in the region, a lot of countries are expecting that they will have more access to foreign direct investment from the US. And they need that. Those economies need FDI from everywhere they can get it. So they need FDI from China, they need FDI from the US, and they can't quite, and here's where the political issue comes in. They are not in a place where they can choose a side, so to speak. They're not in a place where they can say, no, we're going to stick with China, or no, we're going to stick with the US. These countries need both. They need both of these large powers and these very large economies to be investing in them and to be, in a sense, helping them promote their development goals and the other goals that they have. Politically, however, this isn't exactly how the game is being played. I mean, the Chinese, as I said, already have a lot of investments in the region, already have a lot of interests in the region. And the US coming in with this more transactional / aggressive approach and trying to elbow China out does place these countries in a complicated, very complicated position, because they can't do away with either. So they can't anger the Chinese and they can't anger the US. They need to find a way to, given that these two countries are very interested in investing and engaging with them, they need to find a way to, sort of play the interests of both sides to their benefit. But that requires a lot of political stewardship in different countries. And it's the kind of political stewardship that's not really there, especially when you consider that the region is currently undergoing a big electoral cycle, which I know we're going to talk about later in the discussion, with a lot of countries facing general elections in the coming months and even into next year. So, there are a lot of challenges. There are a lot of potential opportunities, of course, but there are also a lot of challenges on the ground facing these different countries at this juncture. And it'll be interesting to see, how all of these things play out over the next several months, including looking at these two very different approaches that China and the US have. And I'll end here. The Chinese have continued to have, this view that the region is full of natural resources. There are a lot of natural resources there that are important for the energy transition and the climate agenda. The Chinese have other interests, of course, but that is one of the things that they're mainly still looking at. Whereas the US has kind of changed its tone. It has kind of put the energy transition climate agenda to the side, and it's really looking at the region from economically from a national security strategy, or from strategies that have to do with securing, in particular, specific types of natural resources, critical minerals, rare earths, the gamut, to precisely enable those national security goals stated in the National Security Strategy document. These are very different approaches, and they can amount to different policies or different pushes for policies in different countries, which we can discuss more during the course of this event.
Thank you, Monica. That's great, and I would like to pick up on a couple of your points. Well, I think we'll pick up on the critical mineral one later, but for now, Jason, I want to turn to you about Monica's point about this electoral cycle, because the region is facing several elections this year. So just to expand on what Monica started with, what are some of the most pivotal ones? And how do you see this, Washington's renewed focus, what Monica just laid out in terms of this positioning, right, where the US might want to try to shoulder China out, but really countries need to walk a fine line. How do you see that dynamic or shaping political dynamics, if at all? And where do you see things headed in this electoral cycle?
Well, that's a great question, Courtney, and Monica. Excellent points. And I'll just kind of add that, as Monica was saying, countries in the region, they want the U.S. to be engaged, right? And as Monica was saying, there is a general appreciation for a new strategy that is all about the U.S. accelerating its engagement, because essentially, when I go and travel, people say, well, we had no other alternative but China, because the U.S. hasn't been showing up. And so now there's an expectation with the new national security strategy that the U.S. will show up. Now, we need to now see that come into implementation, because then the challenge is, if the expectations have been raised and the U.S. private sector doesn't show up in the way that there is now that expectation that's been created, that will create longer term challenges, right? And it's important in the NSC, and I'll get to your question, but the national security strategy, the NSS, the national security strategy, that the president is very specific on this, and he very specific that he says every U.S. official in the region must be up to speed on the full picture of detrimental outside influence, while applying pressure and incentives to partner countries in our hemisphere. So to protect our hemisphere. So, what you don't see in the national security strategy is any particular Latin American country being named, which normally happens in previous strategies, except Mexico is named, but not in the Latin America section. It's named in the China and the Asia section. But what you do see is specific call outs for our different development finance agencies to be able to work more closely in the region and work more closely together for the region. Because if you combine, what Millennium Challenge Corporation and what Development Finance Corporation, the Ex-Im Bank, Small Business Administration, et cetera, if you combine the financial and the technical assistance that they can provide to the region, we're not going to match China. But we're going to come a heck of a lot closer than by individual agencies operating on their own. And I think that's why it was very great to see the reauthorization that was recently approved of the Development Finance Corporation to allow it to be able to work more effectively now in the region. So with regard to elections coming up, I think the most consequential one, and I won't speak. I'll let Monica talk more about the Brazilian election. I'll talk about the Colombia election, which is coming up. We already had the legislative election. We've seen the initial kind of primary elections, and that is, I think, the most consequential election. You got Colombia, you have Peru, you have Brazil. We've already seen the Honduras election and those results. We've seen the Costa Rica election and those results. And both of those elections had candidates win that were favorable to the new U.S. approach to the region. So we're already continuing to see when the strategy mentions enlisting and expanding our allies. Costa Rica has always been an ally. Honduras less so under the previous government, and now we have a new government. Honduras is very committed to working and expanding its commercial relationship with the U.S. But the Colombian elections will be critical. Colombia historically has been not only one of our most important partners in the hemisphere, from economics to security to intelligence, but frankly, Colombia has been an important global partner. I mean, Colombia is a is a is is a is a affiliated with our NATO partnership. It's provided help with during the Afghanistan war with demining in Afghanistan. Colombia has, during the first Trump administration and the focus on Venezuela, Colombia was a very important partner there. And the Colombia story had been a story of bipartisan consensus, where we brought a country back from the brink to being to an era of stability, security. We've unfortunately seen that relationship with Colombia hit probably the lowest point that it has hit, in decades, over the last couple of years. And this isn't just over the last year. This began under the Biden administration. It began when President Petro made his first speech to the UN General Assembly 2 months after being inaugurated, and lambasted U.S. drug policy, which is the cornerstone of the relationship. So it had been a relationship that had been slow deterioration under the Biden administration, and that deterioration is only accelerated under the Trump administration, to the point that U.S. back last fall decertified Colombia, which means that it said that Colombia was not certified as being a partner in our broader drug control efforts. We've sanctioned President Petro, we've sanctioned other members of his administration, have had visas withdrawn, a low point. And tying it back, Courtney, to other global issues, Colombia has historically been a strong partner of Israel as well. A lot of Colombian military equipment is provided by provided by the Israelis. That relationship as well has hit new lows, even before the latest war. And so, what's going to be important is what's going to be the direction in which Colombia is going to go in this next election, right? And you have candidates like Ivan Cepeda, who comes from the same ilk, the same party, Pacto Histórico of President Petro. And then you have people like De La Espriella, who's very different perspective on the right. Paloma Valencia, who did really well in the primary, essentially the consultative votes this 2 weeks ago. And I just had a call an hour ago with a lot of our Colombia constituents, and there's a lot of concern about what's the direction which Colombia going to go. Are we gonna move? Is it, in whoever wins in this election, and there'll be 2 rounds likely. There'll be a first round in May, a second round in June. Whoever wins is there's going to be 2 very different trajectories. Now, President Trump and President Petro surprisingly had a good meeting when President Petro came to Washington last month. Now, I think the question is will that good meeting translate into a better relationship? I haven't seen that quite yet. I think that's going to be important no matter who wins that election, who ultimately takes office in early August. And then, sorry, Peru election is obviously very important as well. Too early to talk about that because we know in previous Peruvian elections, the candidates can change at any point. The previous winner of the last election was an afterthought until just right beforehand. I think we've had now 4 different presidents that have tried to complete the last presidential term. I think in Peru, what's most important is that we start to have greater kind of political stability, which would, I think, mean Congress relinquishing some of its control and some of its ability to be able to remove presidents. And I'll stop on Brazil because I'll let Monica take Brazil.
All right. Excellent. Monica, I want to pick up on the Brazil point. Do you want to actually maybe just talk briefly about Brazil and elections, and then we can go into, I want to pick up on your point about critical.
Then I'll complement everything that Jason was saying. Jason, of course, could speak about Brazil for hours here, given that he is very much a Brazil expert. But so the situation in Brazil is the elections are also pretty consequential, but in a different way from the Colombian case. There have been, as we saw in 2025, a lot of skirmishes. Maybe that's not even the right word, but something to that effect between the US and Brazil, in particular with the imposition of the 50% tariffs last year, and also the sanctions on some Supreme Court justices because of the case with former President Jair Bolsonaro, and the fact that there are some alliances between the Bolsonaro camp and the Trump camp. So that led to a lot of noise, and a little bit more than noise, but it was essentially noise, because the kinds of things that the U.S. imposed on Brazil didn't do much in terms of unanchoring the economy or anything like that. The 50% tariffs were high, but on the other hand, a lot of that was excluded at the get-go. A lot of the Brazilian exports that would have come under the 50% tariffs were excluded because the US is a big market and Brazil is a big exporter of a lot of things like orange juice and coffee and meat. And, it's not as if those tariffs could have remained at that level, because that would have impacted inflation in the US and it would have had a lot of other, not very good outcomes. But that aside, the Lula-Trump relationship has not been nearly as bad as the Petro-Trump relationship, if we're doing sort of this comparison with Colombia. So there has been a sort of a relationship. Yeah, I mean, Lula was even due to come to DC, around now, but of course those plans have been put off given what's happening in the Middle East. And the elections at the end of the year at the moment are very much in the air. I mean, there are two camps in Brazil. There's, the PT camp, the Workers' Party, Lula eventually running for office yet again. And on the other hand, there is also the son of Bolsonaro, Flavio Bolsonaro, who has presented himself as a candidate. The thing that is interesting is that this time around, the Brazilian population or the Brazilian electorate at large doesn't want either. So there's no love for Flavio Bolsonaro, and there's very little love for Lula as well. People want something else. They're tired of both. And so there is scope, there is the space for, and we are still months away from the election, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the next few months, but there is a growing space for a third option to come onto the stage. And there are few characters in Brazil who could play that role fairly well. And I would expect that, anyone who ended up coming into this dispute, this electoral dispute, that can kind of distance themselves from Bolsonaro and the PT simultaneously would probably have a pretty good shot at the presidency at this point. And if somebody like that ends up coming to power, I think it would be beneficial for the Brazil-US relationship because, again, I do see this more space for policy pragmatism with this sort of third option presidential candidate than there has been in the last few years, including with Bolsonaro when he was governing Brazil. So there's some positives here. There are some potential positives. The negatives, of course, is that the country is very fragmented. I mean, in many ways, it's very similar to the United States, just as other countries in the region, too. It's a very fractured society. There are lots of, grievances, very deep grievances. There are major institutional problems going on right now. There's a huge fight with the Supreme Court in Brazil. There are accusations of overreach by the Supreme Court. Congress and the Supreme Court are not seeing eye to eye. The executive branch is kind of caught in the middle. And in the midst of all this, there's a major, major scandal involving a bank, with a figure at the center of it, which is very like an Epstein figure. The person who's at the center of this corruption scandal. And the corruption scandal itself involves literally everybody. It involves the PT, it involves the Bolsonaro camp, it involves a lot of other people, a lot of other important politicians, doesn't affect the Supreme Court, does affect some Congress members. So all of this is making the situation really hard to read, and really hard to kind of get a sense of where things are going to go. But I am hopeful that things are going to go in a fairly positive direction, and that will be good, because if we do have a kind of a middle of the way, by middle of the way I mean between the PT and the Bolsonaro camp, if we do end up with a candidate like that is speaking more pragmatically about the issues, I think the potential for pragmatism with respect to the China-U.S. squeeze on the region is also there. So that's where I see some opportunities. Let me leave it there so that I don't become negative, because I like it when I get positive vibes.
It sounds like the Brazil elections are one to watch, just from an political interest point with the pragmatism, but then also it sounds like there's a whole soap opera undercurrent as well. But I want to get in just a couple more questions and then I'll open it up for Q&A. And so if you're listening and if you have any questions right now, please just feel free to put them in the Q&A box and I'll get to as many as I can. Monica, I just want to stay with you really quickly and pick up on the point you mentioned earlier about how the region is about security for the United States, and you mentioned critical minerals. So I'm just curious to understand what you see as some of the primary economic drivers. Is it critical minerals that's driving this renewed focus? And how might the transactional relationship play out? Are there like a couple of countries or areas that you're watching?
So yeah, I think critical minerals are at the heart of what the U.S. is intending to do in the region. The region will welcome it. A lot of countries will welcome that because they realize. I mean, so let me backtrack a little bit. The region is very rich in critical minerals, and there are some countries, the mineral-rich countries in Latin America. So if we look at Brazil and Chile and Argentina and Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, by the way, are the three countries that compose the so-called lithium triangle. They have together about 70%, 60-70% of the global reserves of lithium. So it's quite a lot. Brazil is also a country that has massive amounts of other critical minerals and rare earths. So when we think about those rare earth elements, that's a very long list of a lot of different types of elements, but Brazil has the second largest global reserve of that after China. So there's a ton there's a huge space for the U.S. to engage with a lot of these countries precisely on the kinds of natural resources that the U.S. is currently looking for. Not because one thing we have to remember about critical minerals is that we started down this path of, critical minerals for the energy transition, but now it's much more than that. It's critical minerals for, yes, the energy transition, but also for defense, because there are lots of weapons and other systems that heavily depend on the use of these critical minerals and rare earth elements. Tech is very heavily dependent on all of these things. And there's a reason why, these are the reasons why for the United States, the critical minerals list, which was just changed in 2025, the priorities for the United States has recently changed, and they've added on to that list of critical minerals precisely those elements that are needed for these other uses. And since a lot of that can be found in the region, there's a lot of potential for agreements, investment agreements, and so on and so forth to be explored. From the point of view of the Latin American countries affected, they're looking to not just engage with investments that would allow them to, say, mine the reserves that they currently have, but they're very much interested in the same thing the U.S. is interested in. They're interested in the middle bit of the supply chain. In other words, the refining and processing part of these minerals, because that's where you get a lot of the value added. And that's what the U.S. is looking to fortify, because at the moment, all of this is done by China, or most of it is done by China. The refining and the processing is all China-based. And so a lot of Latin American countries, the ones that have the lithium triangle, for example, they mine lithium and they basically export the lithium to China. And the Chinese companies, it's the Chinese companies that are basically refining and processing. The US wants to be in on that game, and the US wants its companies to be doing a lot of the refining and processing. So there is a space of opportunity here. And since the Latin American countries also want to be involved in the refining and processing, but they don't have the capacity to do that on their own, they are looking to engage on the investment side with partners that are willing to help them achieve those goals, and at the same time to transfer the kind of technology that they would need to do this on their own. So if that can be found, if that kind of space can be found with the United States, it hasn't really been found all that much with China or at all. If it can be found with the United States, that's a win for both sides, for the United States and for the countries in question.
Great. And I just want, yeah, oh, yes, yeah.
I was going to pick up quickly on Monica's
Yeah.
excellent points and just on critical minerals. And, Monica was mentioning the importance of, especially the lithium triangle, Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. And I think it's helpful for your listeners to know, Monica talked about kind of the overall resources, but Bolivia, over 20% of global lithium resources, right? Bolivia has a new government that just came in. You had years, about, almost 20 years of no relationship with the United States. There now is diplomatic relations. You have a new government. I had the opportunity to speak with the new president 2 months ago. I spoke with the former minister recently, was in Washington, the new minister of mines. They want that U.S. investment because their hope, like Monica said, is that U.S. investment will come, but also that U.S. investment will not be like the Chinese investment, that it'll be value added investment, not just extraction. Similar to Argentina, right? I'm going to be in Buenos Aires in a few weeks. We're doing a big conference on commercial and investment opportunities with the president of the U.S. Exim Bank. And last week, I was up in New York for Argentina Week over at JP Morgan. And President Milei brought about 10 different governors. And some of those governors, including talked to the governor of Catamarca, the governor of Salta, they're all excited about this new U.S. relationship because they're hoping that it brings that U.S. investment again, like Monica's saying, that's going to be value add, and that the future of Argentina and the future of improving that economy is a lot of that's going to be in the provinces. It's not just Buenos Aires focused, and I think Chile as well. We haven't talked about this yet, but there's the new president just took office last week, President Cast. Chile, absolutely fundamental for lithium, over 60% of herbs, but also copper. And President Cast has already come into office trying to make sure that Chile, which has always been seen as a very stable country politically, investment-wise, but that's been oftentimes overlooked. And while it's been overlooked, the Chinese have swooped in. And so President Cast wants to deepen that relationship and is already taking steps with his new economic team to be able to facilitate greater foreign investment into Chile. So I think a few of those points that I think help to further drill down Monica's excellent initial comments.
And to add to what Jason
yeah.
just said, the issue of local governments and the interest of local governments in this engagement with the U.S. is also true for Brazil, for example, because in Brazil, what you see right now is that a lot of the rare earth elements, for example, and some of the critical minerals too, are located in some very specific states. So the state of Minas, the state of Goiás, in Amazonas up in the north, and those governors, they're also extremely interested in these renewed U.S. initiatives. And there's one that I should just mention. I was thinking about it in my remarks, but ended up not mentioning it. The U.S. has just launched an initiative called Project Vault, using the U.S. Exim Bank as sort of the pillar to invest and to fortify these supply chains and basically look to not just secure, the critical minerals and the ore for processing and refining, but also, to involve companies in a sort of, it's a complicated agreement, but it would work as a kind of an insurance. It's not exactly a strategic reserve, but sort of an insurance for critical minerals in the U.S. and with the countries that end up participating in this, whereby if there are problems in the supply chain, say if there are problems stemming from, let's say, China not or cutting off, exports of certain refined and processed elements to the rest of the world, that they would have the via Project Vault, that you would actually have access to these things. So in other words, we wouldn't be as China dependent through initiatives like Project Vault. Things like that are extremely interesting for the region and could offer a lot of opportunities if the higher value added side of things materializes for those countries as well.
Right. Thank you. I'm going to feed in some questions from the Q&A box now, along with I have a couple others left, so hopefully we'll get to as many as we can. So one thing to pick up on, we were talking about getting some of the states and local governments involved. We have a question here, and the questioner writes, what kind of linkages below the level of the US federal government are most impactful with Latin America in setting agendas for the future of the hemisphere? Is it businesses, is it state governments, NGOs, religious groups? What do you see happening below the level of federal government? Jason, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question from Annie here. I think it depends on the country, right? And I'll start there, right? Because you can't look at Latin America and the Caribbean as a monolithic entity. Each country has their own individual relationships, and the linkages that are most impactful depend on the country in question. I'll give an example. Right now, right now in Cuba, severe energy shortages, blackouts, food shortages, medicine shortages, and whatnot. What's most important there is the relationship of the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church has, historically provided important assistance in Cuba. Venezuela, historically, a lot of the NGOs have been incredibly important, especially with the fight for democracy and a democratic transition. Those have been really key actors over the years. I would say in general, and a lot of the work that we do is with business as well, because fundamentally what the region wants is people want like people want in any country. They want better lives. They want to improve they want their economies. They want their not just the economy macro to be better, but they want their household situation to improve. And that's where the private sector comes in, and that's where one of the big challenges in the region is the lack of formal jobs, the high rates of informality, the difficulty in starting a business, the burdensome bureaucracy. So there's a lot of challenges that need to be worked through. The state government relationships are important in a country like Brazil, where state governments have so much are so critical. Like Argentina, we're just talking about. We have not talked about Mexico yet. Mexico is vital, obviously, with the USMCA review deadline of July 1, which will probably continue those conversations beyond July 1 on what exactly the final product looks like. But those Mexico relationships, I think in particular, the Mexico-US relationship is so different from the relationship with any other country because of the close ties that we have, not only sharing a border, but the deep cultural ties, the deep family ties. Those relationships with Mexico in particular, you see the Mexican state governors that are frequently traveling to the United States. Mexico has more consulates across the US than any other country does, but also US governors are consistently traveling to Mexico as well. I've been a number of times when I've been in Mexico, my visits have coincided with US governors that are visiting at the same time. And so those and it's not just the state to state linkages with the border states, but it's also the fact that Mexico is a number one or number two trade partner for pretty much most US states. And so the deepness of that relationship extends across the entire country. So I guess my answer is beyond the federal government, a number of entities are important. It depends on the context, but state governments are increasingly important, and you see a lot of state missions to the region, as well as Annie didn't mention this in her question, but also cities. There is a whole cities summit of the Americas when the U.S. hosted the summit back in a couple of years ago in 2022. And so in many cities, including your New York, Courtney, including New York City, that has an Office of International Affairs. Most major U.S. cities have offices of international affairs, and those offices are frequently dialoguing and working with their Latin American counterparts.
Great. Um, Thank you. We have a question here. I'll turn to you, Monica, with this one, and feel free to jump in, Jason, as well. So the question is about the Shield of the Americas, which is, I believe, the Trump administration's multinational military coalition. Could you just talk a little bit about that and whether or not that has any, if that's going to be used in its China strategy in the region?
Hopefully not. But so let me backtrack a little and say one thing that I think is important. The way the region these days looks at the United States and is seeing all of this renewed U.S. engagement, as I said before, has been largely positive, and it isn't really colored by the history. Yeah, the US doesn't have, especially when it comes to, anything pertaining to military operations, the US doesn't have a very good history in the region. And, it's relatively recent, so many people still remember some things. But it is interesting to see that the countries in general have been so starved of US interest and US engagement that they're willing to kind of overlook that at the moment. That's not to say that there aren't concerns. So there are concerns like, for instance, the US is about to designate two groups that are that are big organized crime groups in Brazil, the Comando Vermelho and the PCC, as terrorist groups. There's a concern in Brazil that this could, in the end, lead to interventions that would not be welcomed in the country. So that concern exists, yeah. But at the moment, there's a lot more interest in sort of leaving that in the background a bit and sort of looking at the other opportunities that the US is offering than specifically focusing on that, which, by the way, is very different from the way that China engages with the region. Yeah, China has essentially been extremely transactional economically speaking, in its engagement with the region. It has not had any kind of other sort of militaristic agenda of any kind directed to the region. And, in some ways that has made countries fairly comfortable with having China in. But as I think all of us have said before, and I think Jason underscored this point earlier, countries don't want to just have China. They don't want to be dependent on China. I think all countries recognize that being dependent on one major economy in the world is not a good thing for them, and that's not what they want. So they're willing to work with the US. I mean, even if the US comes in with a more aggressive strategy, a more sort of Monroe Doctrine like strategy where, it's the policeman of the hemisphere and things like that, the region is willing to work with that. There are differences between countries, of course, and I think Jason highlighted some of these differences. But by and large, I would say that that's where everyone is.
Maybe, Courtney, I'll just jump in quickly on the Shield.
Mhm.
And my colleague Maria Fernanda and I have an article coming out probably shortly in the Hill on this. Is what's going to be really important for the Shield, and complementing Monica's comments, is that it turns from a from an engagement opportunity, among a dozen different leaders. It turns from that to actually moving forward on what's going to be critical for countering the operational phase of the Shield, right? Make illicit finance. It has to be the center of gravity. We need stronger anti-money laundering enforcement. We need better cross-border financial intelligence. We need joint investigations. We need to work together to treat technology as a shared operating system, because criminal groups operate at lightning speed and governments don't, and criminal groups take advantage of that. And we also need to make sure that the hemispheric trade system is resilient, because criminal groups also take advantage of vulnerability at custom points, at ports. And so that we're entering this kind of operational phase of the shield. We've already started to see some of that joint cooperation as part of that came about as part of the Shield. The Shield summit was March 7th. A few days before that, we saw a major U.S. Ecuador security operation in which Southcom provided important intelligence for the Ecuadorian authorities, which was absolutely that was absolutely essential for that specific counter drug operation. And then we also then saw that play out later in Bolivia as well, where about a week later, Bolivian forces with, again, U.S. intelligence support carried out a major counter narcotics operation there. And they arrested a well-known drug kingpin, actually the same drug kingpin who last week when I was traveling to Asuncion, Paraguay, and I landed in the airport, there was a wanted sign for the same person that was captured and the U.S. operation supported by the Bolivians. So we're starting to already see some of this kind of operationally. But I mentioned some of the other points are going to be important for moving the shield forward.
Okay, great. We're getting a couple of questions about Cuba. And so I just wanted to pick up on them. And I don't think we need to dig too deeply into it because we are doing an event next week for members on Cuba, or in 2 weeks. I forgot what month we're in right now. But the questions that we're hearing is whether or not is Cuba really a threat to national security? And might Trump follow a similar scenario as he did in Venezuela? And what is the potential for Cuba as an island economy? So maybe, Jason, you can take the statements about Cuba being a national security threat, and Monica, maybe talk a little bit about the potential of Cuba as an island in terms of its economic prospect.
Yeah, so I think that Cuba is less of a threat now than what it was in the heydays of the Castro years, and the days in which, take us back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the days in which Cuba had strong benefactors whose interests were specifically to harm the United States. I mentioned the years of strong Soviet support, Russian support, all of which dwindled basically more or less in the early 90s around the fall of the Soviet Union. And then you had major support coming from Hugo Chavez and Maduro, and that those lifelines have been taken out by the Cubans, which is why you've seen this the Cuban economy, in addition to a failed economic model, a failed communist economic model. But one of the reasons you've seen that Cuba getting to the point that it is today. You do have Cuban intelligence, right? That was fundamental for Maduro being able to remain in power. Most of the people who died in the January 3rd operation to extract Maduro from Caracas and bring him to a New York City jail were Cuban security, because Maduro didn't trust Venezuelans to be guarding him, and it was Cuban security officials, right? And so Cuba has presented a kind of nefarious threat across the hemisphere. Of course, China's increasing inroads in Cuba. Cuba's other ties to other non-hemispheric countries that are, again, seen detrimental to U.S. interests. But overall, to have a failed economic system, have a regime in place in Havana that is unfriendly to the United States is not in our interest, right? And we've known that for over 7 decades since Fidel Castro came to power, and so that is the underlying basis of our strategy right now. And there's I can't remember another time since the Cuban Revolution where Cuba had so few friends across Latin America, and so this is kind of the moment for a change in Cuba. My hope is that it's not a change at the margins, but it's a change that really brings democracy, political rights, freedoms to the Cuban people, as well as economic opportunities.
Yeah, and I think Jason just underscored where I think the issue really lies, because if the strategy with respect to Cuba is let's just remove the bad parts of the regime and see what happens, in the same way that was done with, or in a similar way that was done to Venezuela, that can be very problematic because, the Cuban economy is practically non-existent. Yeah, I mean, this is a regime that ran the economy to the ground, as Jason was saying, with a failed economic model that hasn't done anything and has really destroyed a lot of wealth in the country. And it's in order for the Cuban island economies are not a problem in themselves. I mean, island economies can be pretty prosperous, even in a complicated region like Latin America. Look at, the example of the Dominican Republic, for instance. It's had its share of troubles, of course, many of them, but it's now an economy that's pretty well run. It's doing fairly well. It has a lot of different activities. Yes, it depends a lot on tourism from the US. It depends a lot on some commodity exports as well, but it has other industries, and it's a country that is doing okay, and it's an island economy, and right next to a very other complicated country, Haiti, which has been, a hot mess for really a very long time. So the fact that it's an island is not a deterrent to anything, but you do need to have a government in place with an agenda, with a strategy, with priorities, with the capacity to govern. And none of these things are given, right? None of these things are a given for Cuba, just as they're not a given for Venezuela, as we're seeing in the case of Venezuela. So yeah, I mean, it's what Jason was saying. Cuba, just like Venezuela, does need to move into a more modern, let's put it that way, framework where you have, a democracy, a regime that's running the country, all of the institutional underpinnings to the economy, without which the economy is just not going to work. So as always, institutions come first. So you need to have, the institutional setup in Cuba that allows the economy to flourish. At the moment, I don't really see how that's going to happen. Well, we'll see. We'll hope for that to happen at some point. It really does need to occur.
Great. We just have a couple minutes left, so I'll do very quickly. I had a couple of questions that I wanted to ask, one from the Q&A box. I'll start with you, Monica. And so this one is, if Latin America's critical minerals are so strategically vital, why has Washington waited this long to offer a serious alternative to Chinese financing? And then Jason, maybe you can pick up on the business interests in the region, and whether or not there'll be a divergence in policy aims and business realities in terms of being able to get the investment to follow where the policy is going.
So let me underline one thing. The geopolitical and the economic importance of critical minerals is very new. Yeah, this is something that has just come down the pipeline in the past, let's say, 5 to 10 years. It really wasn't there before that. So, some of the for some critical minerals, yes, the obvious stuff like lithium and cobalt and nickel and the things that were very much needed for electric vehicles or for the energy transition, the things that were related to the climate agenda. But what's happened in the past few years is that not only have we had this incredible growth in the tech industry and the advent of AI and the so-called AI revolution, all of which needs massive amounts of these resources, and like I said, these resources span a gambit. Yeah. So when we say critical minerals, we're not talking about one or two minerals. We're talking about a list of at least 60 different elements. And the demand for some of these elements simply wasn't there before. I mean, if we take rare earth elements, for example, which are needed for magnets, and remember, magnets are used in everything. They're used in tech, they're used in defense, they're used in a lot of climate applications. This perfect kind of storm, so to speak, for critical minerals is not only fairly new, but it's making use of some elements that previously were not really thought about very much at all. Because the rare earth elements, for example, are fascinating because you don't use them in bulk to produce anything. It's not like iron ore, or copper. You don't mine these things in bulk because you don't need the bulk. You just need bits of quantities of these things. And so to make this economically viable and financially viable, you really need a massive demand. And that demand wasn't there. It now is, with, as I said, not just the climate adaptation needs, but notably the technological ones, the things that are needed for the tech industry.
Thank you. And I think we're just at about time. So Jason, really quickly, do you think that the money will follow the policy into Latin America?
I think most businesses I'm talking to are increasingly looking at Latin America, and they see the focus on the region from the administration. I think the what's important is that this focus on the region doesn't just stay with one administration, but it continues into future presidential administrations as well.
Concise answer. Thank you. That's great, and covers it in a very forward-looking way. So thank you. Thank you both. Thank you everyone who joined us. We do have a couple of briefings coming up. In person in New York, we're doing April 2nd. There we have a public one actually, and it's in person with Avril Haines, the former director of national intelligence. So that's coming up on April 2nd. We do have a briefing, private member only virtual briefing on Cuba on April 9th. So for those who expressed interest in Cuba, please know that that exists as well. Monica, Jason, thank you so much. This was fantastic. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.